Welcome to a special lost episode of Turpentine VC from September 2022, featuring Elad Gil, an investor, entrepreneur, and podcaster who likely needs no introduction. Elad sat down to record this with me at a pivotal moment in AI's trajectory to talk about how he expected LLMs to impact technology. This was before ChatGPT, Perplexity, Claude, and many other AI applications we take for granted today launched. Elad's insights into the foundational shifts happening in AI prove remarkably prescient. Our conversation covers his firsthand experiences at Google, working on early ML systems, closed versus open source models, early NVIDIA takes, labor predictions, AI alignment, and some behind the scenes anecdotes. Please enjoy. I'm here today joined by a very special guest, Elad Gil. Elad, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for including me.
So Elad, you've been in the tech space for over a couple of decades now, and people have been talking about AI for a long time. Why don't you give a little bit more of the history of how AI has been foreseen, or how, when you were coming up as an entrepreneur, people predicted what AI was going to look like?
Yeah, to your point, I think the bar for what AI or machine learning actually means keeps going up. So in the 80s, it was things like, oh, maybe we can have like a plane that can land itself or things like that. And obviously those sorts of things have happened since then. And then I think in the first real AI first company that really worked at scale to some extent is Google, where artificial intelligence kind of pervaded everything that it did early on in terms of thinking about how to rank search results or how to target ads. And so I actually started off between 2004 and 2007 as a Google. And one of the things I worked on was the ads targeting machinery, which at the time was sort of the world's biggest semantic machine learning systems alongside search. And I think, in the early 2010s, there was a big wave of discoveries around things like AlexNet, CNNs, RNNs, deep learning, GANs, all these different innovations, which fundamentally really focused on things like machine vision and voice. And the interesting thing is that a lot of this sort of, you could almost call it like second wave of AI, if Google was the first wave, largely translated into incumbent value. In other words, companies that already existed captured all the value of these models. So for example, Netflix launched a really strong recommendation engine. Amazon launched Echo or Alexa. So you had this voice interface suddenly. Facebook had the news feed. But the reality is very few startups that were AI first actually turned into anything interesting over the last 10 years. And so this first wave of really compelling AI models translated to enormous incumbent value and very little startup value, which I think is a really interesting question in terms of why is that? And now it's happening because of transformers and these large language models. We're seeing a whole slew of new startups, and some of them are actually getting really interesting traction. And so that will be platforms like OpenAI and maybe tooling like Hugging Face, or specific application areas like a Jasper, Copy.ai, what GitHub has done with Copilot, or Replit has been doing in terms of its AI assistant or AI mode, I think are really cool examples where you're starting to see people really at scale using it in ways that you didn't see in the first wave of AI first. And again, incumbents worked, but for some reason, startups didn't in the prior wave.
And do you see that changing, or what needs to be true in order for that to change?
I think there's an interesting question of whether people were choosing the wrong application areas or whether the technology simply wasn't far enough along. Yeah. And I'm guessing it's a little bit of both. I think some aspects of the technology have really been advancing in leaps and bounds. And you can clearly see that because of transformers, which again, were only invented about 4 or 5 years ago and only really got started being used 2-3 years ago, right? And so it's a very recent technology innovation. I think some of the things that these models can do are really dramatically superior to what was done in the past. And the things in the past were already quite impressive. I mean, you talk to Alexa, or you look at some of the results that you get through Google or other things. It's actually, these things work very well in terms of large data sets. But for startups, finally, it seems like suddenly there's this opening, particularly if we start building like a tool or a series of workflows around a core use case. And so I think one of the areas where these things will be really useful or performant from a startup perspective is applications where you have white collar workers who do highly repetitive tasks and don't have a strong workflow tool overall. And so that would be things like Copy.ai for marketing copy. It may be, obviously it's the coding side for various different tools. And it may be all sorts of other types of work. Like you could imagine a sort of Copilot or companion or helper for tools around, physician practices, legal work, summarization of documents, data entry. Like there's all sorts of automation you can imagine. And then in parallel, you could imagine all sorts of really interesting applications on the consumer side. Do you have a better interface to search? If it's a chatbot, or can you create a virtual companion? So I think there's lots of really interesting stuff that's still coming.
We'll get back to use cases in a bit. This is great foreshadowing. But I want to talk about this Transformers paper that you've written about, the all you need is attention post, and why that is so significant. And maybe it's about the authors as well.
Yeah, so Attention is All You Need is a paper that came out in 2017. And there were 8 authors on the paper, and 6 of them have gone on to start companies. And of those companies, 4 are in the AI space or natural language space. And then 1 actually started off that way and turned into the crypto protocol Near. And so and I'd say 4 of the 5 companies started, I believe, in the last 6 to 24 months. And so it's this really interesting wave where the people who first came up with and developed this technology, and it was all Google authors at the time, have since left to start some really exciting companies in this area. And I think Google almost had like a Xerox PARC style moment where, just like Steve Jobs went and visited Xerox PARC and he saw the GUI and he saw the mouse and he saw all the early things that then turned into core parts of what Apple launched later. And Xerox PARC made nothing off of it. They didn't commercialize the technology. Google came up with this amazing breakthrough. And then they kind of sat on it a little bit. The people inside were trying to work on it and launch things, but I think a lot of them got blocked by Google, and sort of a degree of AI safetyism and a degree of fear of brand impact and things like that. And OpenAI, I think, saw this technology and they were really smart about saying, this is the future. And then they went and they built GPT-1 based off of it. And so I think it's kind of a parallel moment to what happened with Xerox PARC, where all the innovation happened in one place, but other people ended up commercializing it. And maybe the big difference here is, instead of all the researchers from Xerox PARC leaving and doing things, my sense is a lot of them kind of stayed there or joined Apple. I think in this case, a lot of the authors off of this paper decided, there's a great opportunity. We're building all these really interesting things inside of Google that could be useful outside. And so let's go and start building companies that are really useful here. And they're not doing direct analogs. It's more just they understand the technology is so fundamental that they can build new things, that weren't available or possible before. So it's a really seminal kind of group of people. And it reminds me almost a little bit of like the traitorous, was it the traitorous 8 or something? That I can't remember the number. The people who all left Shockley Semiconductor to start Fairchild. And then from Fairchild, there was people who started Intel and a variety of other things. Sequoia Capital came out of there. A bunch of really seminal places did.
Totally. No, that's a great analogy. Let's fast forward to today. We've already mentioned some of the big companies and projects. Why don't you do kind of a deeper dive as to the differences between some of them, maybe in terms of design trade-offs that they made, or practical trade-offs, or more even philosophical. There's kind of this open source, closed source, or closed ecosystem conversation that's happening. Why don't you give a bit of an overview of the landscape today?
Sure. So with a lot of these transformer models or large language models, which are a subset, a lot of the emphasis has been on how large these models are and how many billions of parameters do they scale to. And so a lot of the early thinking in the industry is the only way to win is to have these massive models, which means you need a massive amount of compute, which means you need to spend a lot of money on it just for the compute, right? You don't need that many people, but you do need a lot of hardware to train the models. And I think one of the really exciting things that happened more on the image gen side is what Stable Diffusion did, or Stability.ai, where Emad, the founder, tweeted that they spent $600,000 to train their model, which is nothing, right? In comparison to the hundreds of millions of dollars that we're going into some of these companies, or billions in some cases now. And then they went ahead and open sourced it. Once you open source something, it's really easy to modify it. And so that means people were very rapidly modifying things like the safety filters. And there's this whole field of, I don't know what to call it, liberal arts or something, applied to technology, where there's a strong emphasis on not wanting to launch things because they could be offensive in different ways. And offensive is very broadly defined in terms of anything that offends a specific subgroup of people who are focused on safety versus everybody in the world. There's obviously some things that are really offensive that, most people would really want to avoid. But there's lots of other things that may just depend on your political orientation or your specific point of view. And there's a very specific point of view that's represented in all these companies in terms of what safety actually means. And so they made it very easy to strip out that safety layer, which means that suddenly you had an open source model that anybody could use that could be modified in all sorts of interesting ways. So it could take any type of prompt. And that's created this explosion online of different people trying different things simultaneously. And the real breakthrough that I'm waiting for now on the open source side is something that can compete or reproduce the level of fidelity that the GPT models have on the language side, because these are all image-based things that have been open source now. And there's some open source models that are pretty cool on the language side. Luther and a few others are working on these things. Hugging Face has a bunch of these models. But fundamentally, nothing is as performant as GPT-3 or GPT 3.5. And then, of course, GPT-4 is supposedly coming soon. So the question is, can you build that in an open source way? And what's the bottleneck? And is it data quality and cleansing? Is it some model structure? Is it something else? And so I think once that happens, it really changes things, I think, in terms of accessibility of this technology to everyone.
Totally. It is fascinating. Ahmad, the founder of Stability, is tweeting quite a bit, and he's writing about how when people say AI ethics, as you were alluding to, they sort of have one definition of ethics in mind, but there's all over the world very different kind of philosophies when it comes to ethics. And so he's really broadening that AI ethics conversation to kind of a global way where it's previously been among just a very few set of people who all think alike. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves.
Yeah, absolutely. I think he points out, and I'm probably going to get this wrong, but he comes from a very specific religious background himself. And he's like, well, why isn't it reflective of my specific ethical framework versus, a very specific framework that all these people who went to the same Ivy League institution seem to have? And so it seems like a very narrow sliver of quote unquote ethics is represented in a lot of these things. And it'll be interesting to see how these things end up globalizing over time and incorporating multiple cultures.
Yeah.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Our sponsor for today's episode is Carta, the end-to-end accounting platform that's purpose-built to power the strategic impact of the fund CFO. For the first time ever, private fund operators can now leverage their very own bespoke software that's designed from the ground up to bring their whole portfolio together, enabling formations, transactions, and distributions to flow seamlessly and accurately. The end result? A remarkably fast and precise platform that empowers better strategic decision-making and delivers transformational insights on demand, timely K1s, holistic fund performance data, and so much more. Come see the new standard in private fund management at carta.com/investors. That's carta.com/investors. How deep do you go to seek out an answer to a question? Maybe you've spent hours clicking the source links on an obscure Wikipedia page. Or maybe you're even the type of person who checked out the entire shelf on the topic at your library. If you're nodding along, then check out GiveWell, an organization that researches questions about global health and philanthropy. Even if a satisfying answer might require years of reviewing studies, talking to experts, and over 300 footnotes. GiveWell has now spent over 17 years researching charitable organizations and only directs funding to a few of the highest impact opportunities they've found. Over 125,000 donors have used GiveWell to donate more than $2 billion. Rigorous evidence suggests that these donations will save over 200,000 lives and improve the lives of millions more. GiveWell wants as many donors as possible to make informed decisions about high-impact giving. You can find all of their research and recommendations on their site for free. You can make tax-deductible donations to their recommended funds or charities, and GiveWell doesn't take a cut. If you've never used GiveWell to donate, you can have your donation matched up to $100 before the end of the year, or as long as matching funds last. To claim your match, go to givewell.org and pick podcast and enter Econ 102 with Noah Smith and Eric Torenberg at checkout. Make sure they know that you heard about GiveWell from Econ 102 with Noah Smith and Eric Torenberg to get your donation matched. Again, that's givewell.org to donate or find out more.
Let's talk about OpenAI for a second. Of course, we all have friends who work there and we respect what they're doing tremendously. I'm curious, just from like a business model perspective, the trade-off of like, if you imagine in another world where they didn't raise money from Microsoft, what sort of new, how they might have, evolved, or what sort of trade-offs they made by partnering with Microsoft, but what also Microsoft enabled in a way that maybe they couldn't have today. Do you see another world where OpenAI didn't do that, and what could have been?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, OpenAI really feels like the juggernaut now in this sort of area. They recently launched a really interesting API called Whisper as well, which deals with voice and text transcription. And so I think they've really been building a lot of really interesting things, from GPT to DALL-E to whatever. I think Microsoft provides capital and other aspects of a relationship to them. And obviously some of those things can be found elsewhere, particularly over the last few years where we had such a large, capital bubble, right? Where so much money was flowing into tech. And I think their choice of Microsoft as a long-term stable partner makes a lot of sense. I mean, Facebook did the same thing, right? In the prior wave, when they were really thinking of themselves as battling Twitter and Google and sort of everybody else. And they raised a lot of money from Microsoft. And I think that created a stable partner for a while there as well. And so, I think there's a pretty good precedent in terms of Microsoft being a good partner now to a variety of companies as you're scaling in a way that didn't exist 20 years ago when they were kind of viewed as the evil empire that would quash anything that they viewed as competitive, And so it feels like they've taken a really smart ecosystem abrasive approach now.
How about business model? Like, how do these companies become, they're creating a lot of value. How do they capture value? How does stability, for example, become, how does Emad become massively rich? How do these things play out?
I think it's going to really depend on the type of company you have and the area you're focused on. So if you're an API first company like an OpenAI, you could imagine that you're charging off of, some API usage fee. And then the other thing that platforms tend to do, although it may not happen here, is they tend to forward integrate into the apps that are working the best on their platform. And I'm not saying OpenAI has any plans to do anything like that. I'm just saying that's a generic pattern that happens often, but not always. And so you look at Microsoft and its OS, it forward integrated into the things that were used most on Microsoft PCs, which was Excel, Word, PowerPoint, and Access. And they basically bought or cloned multiple companies on their platform that were succeeding there and then subsumed them eventually. And Microsoft apparently was doing really shady things, like they'd change their OS to break any app that wasn't theirs that was competing with their apps, right? So that's one approach. The other approach is you truly have something that is open and you're just charging on the API side. And to some extent, you could argue AWS is more like that. It's kind of like a services layer that anybody can use. Obviously, with things like Mongo and others, they have, in some cases, kind of integrated a little bit and competed. But in other cases, they've left things reasonably open, just build on top of us. They never built Dropbox or whatever it is, even if they had a cost advantage there. It's just possible that OpenAI ends up more like a AWS. I actually have no idea. I don't know their inner workings or plans. If you're a vertical application like a Jasper or a Copy.ai or GitHub Copilot, you can obviously just charge for your service like any other SaaS company. And then I think a lot of the value again in this industry is going to get captured by incumbents. I think a good analogy is mobile, where, when the first real smartphones launched, like the iPhone and Android, there are a lot of really interesting mobile first companies like Instagram and WhatsApp and Uber. And then at the time, people were saying things like, oh, we're building the mobile CRM company. And you're like, well, mobile CRM is Salesforce on your iPhone. It's not a new standalone startup. And I think the same thing will happen here. And so I think there'll be a lot of startups that will either be a technology hammer looking for a nail, or they'll just be things where the incumbent will just win because it's a pure distribution. And it kind of doesn't matter if your product is better or not in that case.
And maybe riffing on the open versus closed, Peter Thiel famously said, AI is centralizing and, crypto is decentralized, AI is communist, crypto is libertarian. How do you view that? Or can you kind of explain what you think he meant by that? And how do you make sense of that claim going forward?
I don't know exactly what the context was in terms of that statement. I think Google and a few other companies were perceived as having a really strong position around AI and machine learning based technologies. And to some extent, the transformer world was one that Google effectively lost, right? They gave it away in some sense. And that doesn't mean they can't come back from it. They're an incredibly talented company with great people, but they created an opening for OpenAI and Cohere and A21 and all these other companies to emerge using technology that was invented in Google to sort of, impact the world in a big way. And that's going to be true of applications as well. There's lots of things that Google could be doing with this. I think fundamentally, though, if you do assume that at some point there will be really strong open source models of what stable diffusion is or stability is doing in the image gen world for everything in this world, and OpenAI, just open source Whisper, for example, then you really change the nature of the business models. And there are lots of open source business models, and often what you end up doing is you end up with a hosted version or a SaaS tool or some equivalent. A lot of the software stack that Amazon eventually ended up providing to people was something that consisted of a lot of open source components that everybody had to stitch together, and they'd rather just go on Amazon, right? You could use a Linux server for free effectively in terms of the software side, but then you had to do a bunch of stuff to make sure it was running all the time, right? And the first versions of AWS just simplified really basic aspects of their platform. So you could imagine something similar happening in the AI world or the machine learning world, where eventually maybe a bunch of the stuff is open source and then there's other services layered on top of it or tooling that you pay for or other things like that. But so far that isn't the case, right? It really seems like, early in a technology curve, there's often a technology advantage to being centralized, that's not always true, right? Crypto is a counterexample to that in some cases. But even the most, quote unquote, decentralized aspects of crypto end up being centralized if you look at them more closely, right? Like if you look at mining pools for Bitcoin, it aggregates, I think, up into 5 to 10 players. And you look at the number of code contributions that are accepted from who, it's a small number of developers. And, you look at the number of exchanges and it's pretty centralized. And so I'm not saying Bitcoin is centralized. I'm just saying many of these things end up being a little bit more centralized than you'd think simply because there's scale effects to every business. And on the AI side, I think it's an open question in terms of open versus closed source, but I think Stable Diffusion gives real hope that there will be a open source version of all this stuff.
Yeah.
Hugging Face is another example of that, actually.
Totally. And the question is, how good will it be relatively? I mean, if you were Imad, like, what would your strategy be, or what would the biggest thing you'd be trying to figure out be, or like, what would you be trying to do? And if you were going against the big guys and you were running Stability or something, or even just open source more generally?
Now, I can't say about Stability specifically, simply because they'll have thought about it much more deeply than I ever will. And so I think everything I'll say will probably be wrong. But I think in general, there's going to be two different aspects to it. One is, what are the areas that I want to impact from a platform perspective most? Is it image gen? Is it language models? Is it both? And then secondly, how do I create long-term sustainability? Because I may be able to keep raising money indefinitely up to a point. And then once that point is reached, what do I do? And so I'd start thinking about the SaaS services that I can wrap around the open source models, or are there some things that are proprietary that I somehow hold back? But again, that doesn't seem to be too much the direction philosophically. And so maybe it becomes more just, what are the SaaS pieces that I build around this, or other aspects of open source models that tend to work these days?
I think I heard Balaji in some group chat talking about, the intersection of kind of open source AI and a token business model. Like, do you see kind of, this juxtaposition potentially happening between the AI and crypto or Web3 worlds?
I mean, you could imagine that a lot of the algorithmic trading and bots and sort of behavior on the blockchain could be governed by autonomous agents that are programmed, right? And so you could imagine these machine learning systems adjudicating different aspects of DeFi or, smart contract adjudication or finalization or settlement, because fundamentally, to some extent, a lot of what's happening in crypto up to a point, I mean, there's lots of different things happening, but one of the things that's happening is you're wrapping money in code and contracts in code, and then you're having them execute on a large scale in parallel, right, in a way that's interactive. And so I sometimes wonder if the first place that a true artificial general intelligence, or AGI, the AI that's actually smart and sentient emerges, or sentient, I should say, emerges maybe on something like a blockchain, simply because you have a utility function that's selecting for economic behavior. And if you look at game theory and you look at the evolution of human species and all the rest of it, you have a lot of things come out of that in terms of cooperation, in terms of competitive games, and in terms of a lot of pretty deep behavior is driven by how do you interact effectively economically with other groups. And economically may mean fighting for food, right? It doesn't mean necessarily a monetary system. And so I think it's a very fascinating utility function against which to evolve a artificial organism.
Yeah.
As well as intelligence, or sentient, I should say.
Yeah. And we'll get to the AGI question in a bit too. I want to return back to the use cases, because you gave some examples that were both on the creative side, i.e. what we're seeing with image gen, but also on sort of just the language stuff more broadly, but then also the caring side. You mentioned virtual companions, stuff like that. And it's funny because, or it's interesting because, in the last decade, there were these tropes that, hey, don't worry, or the last to be affected by AI, the last fields would be the creative fields and the caring fields. And it was more, self-driving cars and, just other kind of more blue collar stuff that was at risk. But it seems that it's almost the opposite to some degree. Self-driving cars has significantly slowed down, and some of these creative and caring fields we really sped up. Is that accurate? And how do you see that playing out?
I kind of view it as asking, where is there highly repetitive, highly paid work that can be automated? Yeah. And wherever that is, that's where I think machine learning will have its first impact. And, I still think self-driving is very promising and exciting, but to your point, they used to really focus on building a robot that would replace farm workers, right? Versus saying which classes of our society either have a big labor shortage and you need a lot more, and it's very valuable and expensive labor, like doctors and nurses, or where are there other types of things that you keep doing over and over again that are a workflow tool that automates it can actually help a lot. And there isn't just software for it, Legal might be an example of that. There may be others. And so I think there's definitely been a broader perceptual shift in terms of blue collar versus white collar nature of machine learning and the implications of where it's going to impact things. If you look at the things that are working at scale today on the B2B side, or starting to work at scale, they're all things that are white collar work so far. And that may change, right? To your point on self-driving or other things like that. And then if you look at it on the consumer side, it's actually had a really big impact on consumer, right? The other AI first company is TikTok, although I guess ByteDance was sort of an incumbent. But TikTok wouldn't exist if you didn't have an algorithmic feed that learned off of you, right? And so it's interesting to see how you keep aggregating this incumbent value on the AI side to Google and Facebook and Netflix and TikTok and all these other things. And yet it hasn't impacted B2B that much yet. I think one interesting aspect of all this stuff is the platforms, on the prior generation of AI platforms, where they said, hey, we'll set up a machine learning pipeline for you for your big enterprise. And those companies, as far as I understand them, have tended to get very good traction with Silicon Valley companies, but then they hit big enterprise, Coca-Cola or whoever it is. And then they tend not to be able to close a sale, or they turn into a services company. They basically build things bespoke for some large enterprise. And I think that's because there's a human capital gap between Silicon Valley and the rest of the enterprise world, where these people aren't even doing regressions, right? They don't know how to deal with their data. They don't know how to clean it. They don't know how to do anything with it. I mean, up to a point, right? They can do some of those things, but they don't necessarily have the human capital to go and implement and use a hardcore ML pipeline without somebody on the other side really handholding them through it, which is the services thing. And so I do think the B2B side needs things that are either vertical and bespoke. So it's really easy to just have a marketing function jump on it. You don't need a lot of extra stuff. Or it creates the internal tooling that makes it really easy for people who aren't necessarily trained in very deep data science to go and do useful things with it. And so I think people need to think more about the workflow and UI and utility of these things versus just is it AI or not?
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Hey everyone, Eric here. In this environment, founders need to become profitable faster and do more with smaller teams, especially when it comes to engineering. That's why Sean Lenihan started Squad, a specialized global talent firm for top engineers that will seamlessly integrate with your org. Squad offers rigorously vetted top 1% talent that will actually work hard for you every day. Their engineers work in your time zone, follow your processes, and use your tools. Squad has front-end engineers excelling in TypeScript and React and Next.js ready to onboard to your team today. For backend, Squad engineers are experts at Node.js, Python, Java, and a range of other languages and frameworks. While it may cost more than the freelancer on Upwork billing you for 40 hours, but working only 2, Squad offers premium quality at a fraction of the typical cost, without the headache of assessing for skills and culture fit. Squad takes care of sourcing, legal compliance, and local HR for global talent. Increase your velocity without amping up burn. Visit choosesquad.com and mention Turpentine to skip the waitlist.
It'd be interesting to see if there's increasing pushback. We're already starting to see, companies realize that maybe they don't need to hire certain actors or certain artists because they can just use these services we're talking about. And humorously, there was a record label that dropped an AI rapper for saying something offensive. But I think there was more broadly just this pushback from the creative field saying, "Hey, this is putting us out of work."
Yeah, I think there'll be lots of really interesting things being done on the creative side. So, for example, if you look at a lot of the image generation stuff, obviously there's applications in art, but there's also probably applications in design tools, graphic design, so there's lots of things where you can imagine a machine generating assets that you could use in different ways as a designer or artist or decorator or all sorts of other things like that. And then similarly, I think there's some really cool things happening more on the music side. And so, eventually you should be able to have, and I know some people are working on this, voices that can be trained on existing, pop singers. And then you could imagine creating artists where the actual singer isn't a person, it's a machine, but it's modulated in a way that corresponds with hits.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think a lot of that stuff is coming for sure. And it'll be interesting to watch the societal implications of that. I don't think it's going to be every artist is a machine, but I do think we'll see a few, and then eventually it'll be many. And I think there's a broader question of over the next 100 years, what proportion of each field is represented by humans or wetware versus machines and hardware, right? And you could almost argue that there's going to be three ages of humankind, right? There's going to be the human only age, which is what we're largely in, or human compute only, which lasted until sometime in the 20th century. And then we're kind of morphing over now into this hybrid age where we're transitioning from a lot of human compute to a lot of machine compute, and therefore machine output and capabilities. And that could be creative capabilities, that could be chess playing, it could be whatever it is. Like a lot of the best chess players in the world now watch machine-based games and learn from it because there's moves they never would have thought of, right? And then lastly, there's going to be an age where most of the output is going to be machines, and human productivity is largely displaced, including in these creative fields where we say, oh, humans are special. And it'll be interesting to ask, what implications does that have for us? And how much does that overlap with this true AGI, this true sentient machine-based life? And so I think we're lucky to be living in this sort of second age of humankind where we have humans still sort of preeminent and machines augmenting us in interesting ways versus, the machine takeover.
Totally. Another telling anecdote, I was talking to someone last night who's a social media influencer across different platforms, and he was complaining that he had to, it's a lot of work to manage, 5 or 6 platforms. And we were asking, oh, why don't you get some help? And he's like, oh, but then it won't be authentic. But I could get an AI, and that would be authentic. So it's just funny to think about. And there's a few companies doing this, but one is personal AI that is trying to take all the information you have on the internet and then have something that acts as you would.
Yeah, I think the deepfake stuff in particular, where you have a machine basically fake a real person, is going to get really intense over the next decade or so. And obviously, there may be ways to detect whether something's a deepfake or not. But especially now, like I heard somebody train a model on voice where they could actually make it sound quite a bit like the person that they trained the voice model on.
Yeah.
And so it's a really nice text-to-speech engine. And so once you have things like that, I think it'll be really hard to tell if an interview is real or not, but in a really deep way, right? Just not only the sound of the voice, but the mannerisms, the euphemisms used, the ums and ahs, the pauses, all the various aspects of a conversation, the examples being used, And so that's definitely coming. And the question is societally, again, how do we deal with that? Or do people just start using these agents to replace themselves? You're a celebrity. Do you get paid for your AI to show up at different events for you effectively, right? Virtually. So.
Yeah, that's pretty funny. There's this famous rapper, his name is MF Doom, who used to wear masks. You never saw his face. And he famously used to have other people show up as him, but it wasn't him. But you can imagine with AI instead.
Now a pretty big chunk of the accounts on Twitter are pseudonymous, or an increasing number are. It reminds me a lot of an Ender's Game, the sci-fi book from the 80s. Two of the main characters adopted pseudonyms and then posted and influenced politics on a global scale, right? It was two teenagers.
Yeah.
So you could imagine something similar, except instead of teenagers, it's a machine. So
totally.
That definitely seems like it's coming.
You mentioned in your post that one of the big questions is, in terms of developments, like what needs to come from science versus what needs to come from engineering. When do you unpack that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. I think the science versus engineering question is a little bit of, there's almost two models of things, which is you need this really deep scientific or algorithmic breakthrough to get something to the next level from a technological perspective. And so that would be things like, inventing fusion, being able to fuse two atoms to produce electricity, or things like inventing the transformer models to begin with.
Yeah.
And that contrasts with iterative engineering, where you're taking something and you're optimizing it and making it more performant. And you often see, for example, at a startup in the early stages of it, they have some really sort of janky backend infrastructure. They scale on top of it. Everything starts breaking and it costs tons of money. And then they do a giant redesign, and suddenly they're paying 5% as much to run the system. And so to some extent, you could ask, when does the machine learning world hit that point on the transformer model side or the large language model side? Because if it takes hundreds of millions or $1 billion to train a model, if you can make it 95% cheaper because you're making it more efficient, then suddenly anybody can train it with tens of millions of dollars or millions of dollars instead of hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. And so both are now being tried. I think increasingly people are still trying to scale up these models. GPT-3, I think, had 175 billion parameters or something like that. And the question is, can you actually spend less on compute and more on just optimization? And what's the trade-off there? And when do we get to the point where it's optimization becomes more and more important in terms of some aspects of performance? And it's already important. I'm just saying, it's possible that in the early stages of most technologies, you don't spend as much time on just raw optimization. The one other place also you could get better performance is if you can iterate on the chip level. So can you build semiconductors that are specialized for large language models, for example?
And relatedly, why is there no massive AI chip company?
Yeah, I've been wondering that for a while. There's some really cool startups like Grok or Cerebras. Ken Storm is another one in the market. But if you look at it, every technology wave has a underlying tens of billions semiconductor company that's built. And so for the microcomputer revolution, that was ARM and Intel. It was AMD and Intel. For mobile, it was ARM and Qualcomm. For Broadcom, for networking chips, it was Broadcom. And NVIDIA, I think, has been pretty unique in terms of being able to bridge with its GPUs, not only graphics, which is what it was originally invented for, but crypto mining of certain types. And then now also the ML world. And really, if you look at what you're doing when you're doing these current wave of machine learning models, is you're doing a lot of matrix multiplication. And most of the surface of the GPU really isn't optimized for that, although they're coming out with better and better models for it on the NVIDIA side. Google, a couple of years ago, invented something known as TPUs, or transfer processing units, which tended to perform much better than NVIDIA, at least in the early tests they showed around some of the earlier versions of neural networks. But they never commercialized that externally except through their cloud. And, some people argue that the reason NVIDIA has continued to be preeminent is, number one, their founder, Jensen Huang, is considered very good. He's still running the company, and I think that makes a difference. You have a founder CEO still driving it. So they're going to be more nimble and willing to adapt. Two is they've really built great software tooling. So, they have CUDA, and they have a few other things that everybody's really excited about in terms of making it easy to use their chips. And then lastly, a lot of the startups haven't spent as much time on the interconnect layer, which means, can you have hundreds or thousands of chips acting together in concert versus single chip performance? And so those things I think really matter if you're scaling. And so those are kind of the arguments I've heard in terms of why there isn't a standalone semiconductor company that's kind of displaced NVIDIA yet.
Yeah, it makes sense. I want to return back to this conversation we were alluding to earlier. We're kind of, leaving the reservation of what's going to happen in the short term into more like medium and long-term stuff. But you mentioned the human era, the human machine era, and then the machine era. If, we're talking a few decades from now, we're the machine era. I heard someone say once, is it the best case for humans is that we're house cats, and we're friendly and we provide some joy to them, but that we're not running the show. Do you agree with that? What is the best case scenario for humans? And I'm curious more broadly, like we were talking about AI ethics, but what does AI safety mean in a world where that, to the extent that seems to be the default or seems to be obvious or become obvious at some point as this thing is just advancing? How do you see that developing? Is our best case scenario that we're house cats in the machine era?
So I think a lot of the AI safety stuff is a very broad and almost over-encompassing term. So what a lot of people are talking about now is AI alignment, which is how do you ensure that some future sentient AI and humans are aligned in terms of, helping each other or working well together versus just pure competition. It's really hard to guess what the long-term outcome will be. The optimistic view is that there will be some brain-machine interface and humans and AI will somehow meld, and then we go through some transcendence and we become these sort of super beings where AI helps us become super intelligent and all this stuff. And it's really unclear to me why AI would want that, what the benefit to the AI is. So it seems like a very human-centric view of the world that seems very hard to enforce, particularly if you have large pieces of self-aware code being able to copy and modify themselves. Because then you're talking about reproduction and evolution, right? Copying is reproduction, and modifying or editing your own code base, which, with GitHub Copilot, we see that machines can do. It means that you can evolve. And then the question is, what's the utility function against which you evolve? What are the drivers that cause you to adopt one behavior versus another and reinforce that behavior over evolutionary time? And depending on what those drivers are, there used to be old jokes in the AI community that eventually an AI would turn the entire universe into paperclips. Because if it started off as a paperclip automation piece of machinery and somehow it gained sentience and then it took over, its primary function for utility is making paperclips, right? And that's obviously an absurd view of the world, but it kind of shows that your starting point may matter in terms of the utility function you're evolving against. Or it's possible that as you start reproducing and spawning, there's other things that take over. And you see that just in the biological world, right? I never would have a priori predicted viruses, right? Little bits of DNA or RNA that eventually only real focus is self-copying in another organism's cell and unable to reproduce otherwise, right? It's kind of like a degraded piece of genetic information in terms of what it actually tries to do. And so you could imagine if there's an AI ecosystem, eventually all those that variety of different types of life, parasitic or what have you, should exist, right? And so then the question is, how do all these things compete with each other and then compete with biological life?
Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting, deep, long-term question.
Totally. So this has been a wide-ranging conversation. I want to summarize your thesis in terms of what companies you expect to see going forward, and you list three here. And maybe you could do a summary closing statement here, which is: one is platforms and infrastructure, two is AI de novo standalone companies, and three is the tech-enabled incumbents, where the incumbents should just add AI and startups will lose to distribution advantages. Why don't you unpack those three and we'll wrap on that?
Yeah, no, I think those are really exciting areas, and each of them will have a lot of really interesting things emerge. And I think some of the things will be obvious at the time or, in foresight, and then some of them will only be obvious in hindsight. So in mobile, for example, it's really clear there would be a next-gen messaging app because you were texting and that's what's up. But then I never would have guessed that you push a button on your phone and a stranger shows up in a car and you just get in, right? Which was Uber. And so I think some of the most interesting things may be things we can't predict. But I definitely think there will be a number of platforms. OpenAI obviously appears to be the winner so far. Incumbents like Google can always make a comeback, or there may be interesting new startups like a Cohere or A21 or others who do really interesting things there. So I think that'll be exciting. I think on the standalone AI first apps, a few interesting areas include these, broader workflows or automations where AI is a core part of it, but it takes a repetitive, high-paying job or low-paying job for that matter and creates a workflow or wrap around it. So it isn't just, hey, we're using AI, but we're using this tool that helps us do something very specific better in a specific vertical. Or maybe things like consumer applications. TikTok, again, was an AI first application. There's probably lots of other ones coming. And so I think that whole area is super exciting. And then to your point, I think like with many other waves, we'll see a lot of the value occurring to the incumbents. And the question is, what is that ratio going to be? In crypto, all the value so far has gone to startups. In the prior wave of like the Web 1 world, it was a mix, right? The biggest companies in the world were startups, or a subset of the biggest companies in the world were startups from that era, right? Like Google and Facebook, but a subset were incumbents who eventually adapted, like Microsoft. And so the question is, what is going to be that ratio between new company value and old company value? And in this wave, I'm guessing it's going to be a mix, and I don't know which way it skews, right? The prior ML wave almost entirely went to incumbents. My hope is that this ML wave goes much more to startups. And if you count OpenAI as a startup, we're already seeing that happening.
Yeah. I think it's a good place to ask this one final question, which is, let's say we're doing another AI deep dive in, let's say 2025 or a few years from now, and it's the Elad Gil of 2025, 2026. What would be the biggest questions you'd be most curious about in terms of what's how things might play out or where the forks in the road are that might change where the space goes?
I think the most interesting two factors at that point will be, number one, how good are the open source models? Because I think open source will really function as almost like a release valve on a lot of entrepreneurial energy. I think that it will already happen through great APIs like what OpenAI provides. But I do think that Stable Diffusion has really provided a good example of once you have something that anybody can use really easily, it really opens the door for all sorts of different use cases and applications. So one question is, what's open source versus closed source? And then the second will be, how good are these models now? Because if the exponent continues, then some version of GPT 4, 5, 6, 7, wherever it is, at that point, could do pretty amazing things, right? Imagine you just open up your email and every email already has a pre-written response and you just click approve. Or sales leads for Salesforce or whatever it may be. Or you could imagine, 50 Shades of Grey was just fan fiction for Twilight, right? Imagine if you had AI writing fan fiction books.
Yeah.
Or you could imagine taking any book and having it turned into a graphic novel or an anime by a machine doing, machine-based imagery and image gen. And so there's really exciting, crazy stuff that's coming. And there's some really short-term obvious ones, right? Like every book should be turned into an audiobook by a machine and then translated into every language in the world. But, what if you open your phone up and you can get care equivalent to a Stanford cardiologist anywhere in the world for really cheap because you have a machine model that's been trained on the best cardiologists in the world, right? What does that mean in terms of global healthcare? And so I just think there's, or education, right? You read the book, The Diamond Age, and there's really good analogies to an AI driving education of girls en masse in China through this book that got accidentally open sourced, right? Or stolen and then open sourced in the book. So I just think there's really exciting stuff coming. And the question is a technology curve one, and then a ownership one. How many people can participate in it?
Yeah. And what does it mean? Like if there's one clear winner and it's, let's say, OpenAI or some other company, what does it mean for that company's power? Like how does the balance between corporations and governments and even, just organizational, power feels interesting as well?
Yeah, I think it'll be fascinating to watch. And I think there's still a lot of room for other platforms, and it doesn't have to be just one. I mean, if you look at the equivalency on the cloud infrastructure side, you have AWS, but you also have Azure, and then you have Google Cloud, right? And the question is it more like that, or does the data and the feedback loops and the closed loop systems matter? And they do so far, right? For the development of really performant machine learning models, and how many companies will be able to sort of compete relative to each other in that world. And my hope is it's a lot, it's many, but most markets of this type tend to consolidate into a handful of players, which is what happened on the cloud side. And that's what happened on the mobile platform side. And, you tend to have these oligopoly markets emerge in these sorts of situations. And so it probably isn't one, but it probably isn't 20. And so the question is, what does that world look like? And you probably have like one or two Chinese versions, just like you have the Alibaba cloud and things like that.
Yeah.
That'll be interesting to see.
Totally. That's a good place to wrap. My guest has been Elad Gil. If you want to go deeper, I highly recommend the blog post that's on Elad's website. Elad, of course, also has the great book, High Growth Handbook for Entrepreneurs, that you highly recommend reading. And Elad, of course, is a well-renowned investor you'd be lucky to have on your cap table. Elad, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a lot of fun as always.
Turpentine VC is a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Moment of Zen and Econ 102. If you liked the episode, please leave a review in the Apple Store or rate us on Spotify. Hey everyone, Eric here. At Turpentine, we're building the first media outlet for tech people by tech people. We're the network behind the show you're listening to right now. We have a slate of hit shows across a range of topics and industries, from our AI and investing cluster of podcasts to shows that drive the conversation in tech with the most interesting thinkers, founders, investors, and influencers, like Econ 102 with Noah Smith. We're launching new shows every week, and we're looking for industry-leading sponsors. If you think that might be you and your company, email me at ericaturpentine.co. That's ERIK at turpentine.co, and let's partner together.